rights out of them because of what its effects would be on the practice of religion. But there were developments, initially, of course, of taxation, which they wouldn't accept because they had no role in it, despite the fact that most people in Britain never had a role in their own taxation. But they saw evil in that. They saw evil in the reorganization of government, with more officials being sent to police trade, to keep the restrictions on trade, which have been very loose, to tighten them up, to bring in higher income, and they experienced in certain places a lack of independent judiciary, since in the case of Massachusetts, judges who long had been paid and their minds controlled by local assemblies were now being paid by Britain directly from the income that was made from customs in America. That was a blatant sign of growing disorder to their disadvantage. And there were others that had to do with trade, as the British government after 1763 tried to create a controlled and profitable colonial empire. So you'll talk about this more in the next episode, but would you probably agree that there's this belief that Britain is trying to exert absolute control on the colonists?
Yeah, and they really weren't, but they weren't very good at communicating their desire. The British government was not. And they were, first of all, communication was very difficult simply because of the sheer amount of time it took to get letters across the Atlantic back and forth. But the various prime ministers during the period we're going to look at in a little bit, and King George himself, they were not very good. How do I say this? They just weren't, they were stubborn, and they didn't do much to dissuade the colonists from thinking what they were thinking. Every time they would withdraw some new law or something, it was too little, too late. And it just weren't, I don't know how to phrase it other than they didn't do much to relieve the fears of the colonists. They would never say, no, we're really not. What we're really trying to do is this. They weren't willing to sit down at the table and negotiate because they were so, as you mentioned, stubborn and arrogant. They were not evil and they were not trying to be despotic, but they sometimes really came across like they were.
That's a change that caused this to happen. And the last change that I think triggers the American Revolution are changes in the colonies themselves. And I had a guest on who has a podcast devoted to the American Revolution, and he argued that the revolution happened about as early as it could in American history. So it couldn't have happened in 1710, for example, or even, he thinks not even really 1760. And the amount of change, right. The amount of change that happens is shocking. It's about as early as it could, which if you think about it, there's a long period of time when they're colonies. I mean, when we study history, we think, okay, Columbus, 1490 through Plymouth Rock, and our minds crunch together 1620 and 1776. That's a long time. I mean, England takes a while to establish a good beachhead with the colonies, with the Jamestown colony in 1607 in Chesapeake Bay, and then the Maryland colony with Lord Baltimore, and then New England in 1620. But it's almost 200 years, or about 150 years before there's an independent culture that can be unified enough to wage a war. By no means was there an idea of a unified America. I think when we concluded the Civil War podcast series, we mostly agreed that the idea of being more loyal to your nation than a state really solidifies after the Civil War. Before then, you would say the United States are, but then it was the United States is. Now, going back in time to the Revolutionary period, it's much, much looser then, but at least the seeds are being planted at this time where there's at least a loose sense of cohesion. And that's due to a number of reasons. Part of it is there are events that happen like in the 1740s. There's the First Great Awakening, where sectarianism, the type of church that you belong to, whether Quaker or Mennonite or Unitarian or Presbyterian or whatever, doesn't quite matter as much, where there's a interdenominational religious movement that's taking place, and there's an interdenominational unity among Protestant groups. By no means, not all Protestants, I am not saying that, but there's at least something that is happening that's connecting Anglicans and Presbyterians and Congregationalists and other people together.
Right. Yeah. You developed a split after the First Great Awakening that transcended denominational lines. Just like you said, you had people that were basically anti-Great Awakening and pro-Great Awakening. They were called Old Lights and New Lights. And And both camps had people from pretty much every denomination, Congregationalist, Presbyterian, you name it. So yeah. And another thing that happens in the First Great Awakening is people like George Whitefield, they come over and they go all over the colonies preaching, and he becomes famous. I always tell my students he was the first American rock star. Even though obviously there was no rock music. He wasn't a musician, but he was famous up and down the colonies, and he helped to bring that sense of cohesion that you're talking about. Again, it was far from complete, but still, it was, things were different after the Awakening than they were before the Awakening. Not to mention that, but the Awakening with these new lights coming up who were being not persecuted by the old lights, but ridiculed. And these new lights, these people that were pro-Awakening, said, well, we don't need these church leaders to tell us what to do. We'll start our own churches. And so there was a questioning of ecclesiastical authority, which pretty soon develops into a questioning of political authority as well. So that's one thing that I learned a number of years ago. And when I first heard somebody say this, it was like a light came on. But the Great Awakening had political ramifications, not just religious ones.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Right, with a populist religious movement, then why not a populist political one? And I would be remiss if I talk about changes and I don't talk about economic history. And people's brains shut down when you hear economic history. They think, okay.
Yeah, mine just did.
Think, all right, nerd, take your spreadsheets and go home. I don't want to hear about it.
It's like,
and I have to be honest, even for me, in academic history, when you look at an economic history and you open it and skim the pages, you see tables and data sets. And yes, it does fry your brain. But if you don't talk about money in the picture, then you're not getting the whole human story. And that's what's happening in the colonies as well, where from a lot of the population, the new blood that labors in colonial America in the 1600s are indentured servants. But from about the 1700s onward, the new flow of indentured servants really trickles to a crawl for different reasons. That there's an easing of religious persecution in Europe, so there's not as many people are chomping at the bit to leave. There's improved economic conditions in Europe, where the British trade empire, the value for exports is booming. And the way that to overcome this labor shortfall is to import more slaves. So this leads to slavery, and that's a whole other discussion. But the point being that when you don't have a constant inflow of people from England, this constant replenishing of blood of British culture doesn't happen. So there's a chance for this unique colonial culture to consolidate when they're left on their own for the most part. Now, there's, of course, comings and goings between the major cities and England that never stops. But there are at least the seeds of these. Now, there were few people who really traveled amongst the colonies and saw America as the whole being a greater than the sum of its parts. There are unique figures like Benjamin Franklin, who as a postmaster in his capacity is actually traveling amongst the colonies. And that's also what makes him such a great candidate to be an ambassador for the Americas and an early founding father. So there are very few of these trans-colonial figures, but they do exist. And these seeds are planted in this period. So I would say that for the very first time, it is possible for an American Revolution to take place due to these different factors. Think I left any out, James?
No, I would agree with what you said. I would add there had been actually an attempt to create not I don't know if I want to say the word a central government, but some kind of central body to coordinate and combine the colonies, the individual colonies' efforts. There was this conference in 1754 during the French and Indian War called the Albany Congress or Albany Conference. I think it's usually called the Congress. And this was an attempt. In fact, this was ordered by the British government. The British government told colonial leaders, hey, you guys need to figure out a way to be more organized, to get together instead of being almost like 13 different units, 13 different entities. So there was actually an Albany Plan of Union put together, which would have created the seed of a central government or a federal government, but it did not pass. It was just a little too early then. But But again, they tried. At least there was a try, and this is a lot of leaders from different colonies got together, got to know each other, and kind of laid the seeds for later Congresses that we'll talk about.
Right. But what really triggers it, and what we'll talk about in the next episode, is a number of things the British government do. So basically, terrible government policies are what trigger the revolution. So we'll talk about all these different things that cause a revolution to happen in the next episode. So that is the episode for today. As always, I want to thank the Knowlton's Rangers, especially our spy masters, Todd Warren, Jake Harrington, Beverly Engel, Bill Ivey, Joyce Norman, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Baron Fraser, Chris from Maine, Carl from Norway, Moondoggy from Ohio, Rick Knowlton, Vic and Irene, Mike from New York, Michelle, and Marlene. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books: Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.